As a CPG brand, it's really challenging to forecast how much product you are going to sell and therefore how much inventory you're going to need for your business. And it's this balance between demand and supply, which is core to running an inventory-based business and causes a huge ton of turmoil for founders. And so what I want to do today is have a conversation around how do you actually run demand planning for food and beverage brands so that you can accurately forecast how many sales you're going to have and therefore how much inventory you need and when, and how to start making those decisions. So for this conversation, I invited on Wiley Jones, who's the co-founder of DOS, and DOS helps brands plan out their resources across inventory and sales for their CPG brands. Wiley, welcome.
Thanks, Jordan. Great to be on.
So let's jump right into it. As you've seen, kind of walk us through kind of how brands should go about thinking about demand planning, what it means, and the strategy behind it.
Yeah, we, um, you know, we're big content reusers as much as possible, but this is a kind of an evergreen topic for every industry that we work with. So, as a company, DOS, we are a full system of record. We build an ERP solution, pretty similar to a lot of things that customers and listeners of the food bevy audience might be very familiar with. The Sin 7 and NetSuite and those types of products. We're very similar to them. The main thing is that we don't just work with food and beverage folks and CPG brands. We work with construction companies, industrial manufacturers, even hardware and technology companies, aerospace, and so demand planning is actually the same under the hood for almost all of these people. When you think about them at about 80% fidelity, and you think about the baseline problems they have, that final 20% that makes your company unique, especially in food and beverage, can get particularly difficult. And so we adapted kind of this presentation for specifically food and beverage brands because there's a couple of really core distinctions, and I wanted to kind of show those off. So when we talk about demand planning, high level, we're going to talk about who should care about it because not every company should care about demand planning, and maybe you aren't a business that should care, and like that, then you can just check out, right? And you're focusing on other things in your business. What are the variations and patterns we see? What's a reasonable framework to apply where you don't spend too much time, doing the work around the work? And then how do we actually go and implement this ourselves? And we can kind of talk about, at the end of Q&A and anything that comes up in your mind at the end. So broadly, what is demand planning? Demand planning is the workflow that you run inside of your business where you're estimating future demand and you're just ensuring that your business has the right supply to meet it. And it's about predicting the future for what your customers need, when they will need it, and how much you have to deliver. So what it tactically means in practice really depends on what you actually do as a business. Not every business should care about demand planning. If you are a business that should care about it, it's probably the single most important workflow in your company, maybe behind like the actual production or if you're a company that doesn't do that yourself and you have maybe co-mans or something, then it probably is actually the most single most important one. So who should care? Um, Basically, you really only need to care about it, in my opinion, and I think broadly, like all the frameworks that are out there, they kind of distill down to this point, which is if you have durable demand, where you have some level of reproducibility over a time period or a period of seasonality or a period of events that happen, then yes, you care about demand planning. If you do not have durability, where your input to your business is you're going out and you're running ads or you're going and trying to get off the ground for the very first time and you're not sure what's going to end up happening, you probably need to take a bottoms up approach to the tactical things you're doing on a weekly, monthly basis. And then that will drive individual decisions on what you need to go and buy. You probably don't want to go and run through a very analytical framework around demand planning if you don't have durable demand.
Have you
So
seen a commonality between businesses of like when they're can understand that predictability? Like, is there a common revenue number? Like, okay, after brands hit $5 million in sales, then they can start to plan a little bit better, or does it really just depend on the product of the business?
um, I would say that like it's an emergent property that doesn't that's like loosely correlated with money. Like obviously a company that's doing $100 million in top line or $20 million in top line or $5 million in top line, they probably have pretty durable demand because in order to have that large of a revenue run rate on what they're selling, if you're doing that without durable demand, like I don't know how you did that, right? The where the gray area is like if you're doing 200K, across like two or three customers and it's a quick pop and you're not sure if they're going to come back, like, you know, and that's a question is like you need to have the level of conviction about bottoms up, is our business going to go and reproduce this again next year when so and so comes back to us and wants to buy again, right? Or oh, we just got into this like really large Costco promotion. Like that's a bottoms up thing you have to think through as opposed to the top down, which really demand planning is more of a top down function. The top down of like, well, we have some level of predictability.
Awesome.
Yeah. So we do actually kind of get to how we fuse these together in a bit. So variations and patterns. So this is actually kind of my general purpose version of this. Um, you know, when we think about how to fill in the rough heuristics, and so the rules of thumb for how your business should think about demand planning, we have to look at kind of top down of like, do you sell to end customers and consumers, or do you sell mostly to other businesses? Do you do it all online? Do you do it all in person? Do you do it all wholesale? What is the mix across these? Like most companies are, I don't know if I would use the word omni-channel, but most companies are like N+1 channel. Like they're doing more than one thing, and maybe they're not doing every single thing under the sun, but they have like two or three channels that drive almost all of their volume, and they need to kind of focus and stack rank these in terms of priorities. Where do you hold stock? How do you hold stock? Do you hold stock? Like very basic questions about this will drive heuristics for, well, if you have stock that you hold, that means you can fulfill some amount across some channels, across some time frame. If you have a lead time, a shelf life, and you need to keep it in cold storage, that actually ends up also determining how quickly you need to refill in. If you have a SKU mix, if you have 100 SKUs versus you have two SKUs, you fundamentally need to change how you do demand planning. And so all of these things, like they kind of form this composite thumbprint or like, fingerprint for demand planning for us means this. But again, you can see how much variation there is just on this one page. And this is just scratching the surface of the questions you should be asking yourself as a business.
Yeah, this seems very
Um,
complicated, and as I think is why it's very confusing for a lot of businesses who are trying to get a grasp on this.
Yeah. So really what it comes down to is like first just like deeply scrutinize the characteristics of your business that are like this, which is, well, do we produce finished goods? Okay, that really changes a lot of stuff. Or sorry, are we just procuring finished goods or are we actually going and buying components, buying material, buying packaging? And what are the lead times for all those things? How do we actually have to buy them at minimum order quantities? How do we then consign those to our co-mans? What is our relationship like with our co-mans? Are they going to bump us in line behind other people? Like, these are like very real things you have to factor into the architecture of your demand planning. But what we find is a lot of companies just like won't even have answers to these questions laid out in front of them in order to drive the heuristics first. Like, so just start by doing this. It's very much like a self-study and an introspection first and foremost.
Love that.
Yeah. So, it's easy to get like lost and turned around. Like as you said, there's a long list of questions, and I'm describing that this is just scratching the surface. But like really fundamentally, you're just trying to do two things. You're trying to not stock out and you're trying to not produce over inventory. Like we look at that as the top and the bottom of the boundary conditions of what we're trying to optimize for. We're staying within those two lanes. And you can think of them like bumpers in a bowling lane or something. You just want to bounce between those two. You don't want to go outside of them. And as long as you're not going past them, you can hit them and kind of hit those edges where you get close to stocking out or you can get close to overproducing. But if you have good guardrails in place and effective guardrails in place, you're going to be able to prevent that. And we'll get to that in a bit. But
This objective piece I think is really interesting, and maybe we can talk about it a little bit later. I was having a conversation today about someone who mentioned they underproduced and missed out on maybe 10% additional revenue that they could have had for the year. And my
yeah,
perspective was you also sold 100% of the product that you produced, and so you didn't have any additional like underutilized inventory that you kind of guaranteed versus revenue is always hard to predict in the future if you don't know it's actually coming. And so it's really
yeah,
interesting in terms of like underproducing and potentially missing out on opportunities versus overproducing and having the cost of that inventory.
yeah. It's And it really goes back to this thing here, which is like, if you're a company where you feel like you have the ability to sell your inventory in a durable manner, then it's a lot simpler to go and it's a lot easier to go and optimize for point A. If you're optimizing for point B, you're probably a company, or you're looking at this through the lens of maybe you're bringing out new SKUs and you truly don't know how they're going to sell. And you have a level of conviction, and your retailers have a level of conviction, or whoever it is your partners are, and you want to slowly ramp your way up and test that. Or you're like, you know what, we're going all in on this SKU is the future, we're going to kill our old products and our evergreen things, we're sunsetting them and we're going all in. That is a business strategy, but you do need to put it through first, rigorously stress test it and pass it through the lens of what's in here, right? That's, I think, a very important point, is like, at the end of the day, demand planning becomes deeply connected to your business strategy. And if you don't have a lot of clarity around the reasons why you're doing certain things, then you probably will go out of bounds in this optimization problem.
I love that. Yeah, it's probably good just to think about like make a decision on which approach is right for you in the right time of your business versus just letting it
Yeah.
happen to you.
And which SKU? We talk to people who, like, they basically split their SKUs a lot of times, where they'll say, look, here's new stuff, and then here's evergreen. Evergreen, we know exactly how to optimize it because it's like we have like 5 years of historical data. It's very easy for us to understand that when we go in and increase ad spend, that like the SKUs, that the sales just go up or something. Um, or like we know our reorder points with our distributors. We're even tracking their inventory. We know when they're going to reorder. Like, those are areas where you can really go in and optimize for the opportunity cost of missed sales. Where you probably don't want to optimize for the opportunity cost of missed sales is when you're doing new stuff that's risky. And like the canonical like Icarus like tale of flying too close to the sun here is the Peloton example. They got over their skis and they thought they, as a business, were going to sell a Peloton to everyone in America, and they held a lot of inventory, and it basically destroyed the company. And you could, I'm sure there's lots of people in the, maybe not in the CPG world, but in operations and finance and supply chain, would look at that and be like, yeah, they just made a very simple mistake, which is that they had too much conviction about a pretty high risk strategy.
Awesome.
So if we kind of paint a picture about this is a fun example, but you know, I do this also not just in, like I said, in CPG, but we can kind of paint this as kind of the prototypical example of any physical operations company. And in this case, let's just say it's a CPG business. And so, we have a supply chain manager, an operations manager, especially for our smaller brands. That this is probably you. You're probably the CEO or the founder or the co-founder, or whatever your role is. There's a very small group of people, and you're having to go and do a bunch of this manual work to make sure that all the stuff that happens back here in your value chain eventually makes its way into your end customer's hands. And this person's like, well, let me go run demand planning. How do I actually know what I need to go and do to effectively optimize for this point here, right? We're going to try and optimize for point A and point B kind of at the same time. And well, let's go and pull a bunch of data, right? And everyone starts here. Let's just go and get stuff from Shopify. Let's go and get our EDI orders that we got from multiple retailers. And let me go pull all that stuff out of my email inbox that I got from those random grocers or whatever it is, right? You go and you pull data out of your 3PLs, try and find all your inventory, or maybe you have your own warehouse and you're going and doing recounts. You're going to your commands and being like, what do we have on stock on hand still? When is your production available? What are your schedules? If you have suppliers for, or second tier suppliers for, let's say you're going in and procuring a bunch of unique formulations and unique ingredients, and you're going and working with a flavor house or whatever it is. You have to go and work with them also. You're pulling in all this data and kind of building this composite understanding of the state of all of your partners and where their ability to execute for you, where that stands. So a bunch of questions come up. All the things of like, okay, are we going to be able to do partial shipments? Like, do we need more line space? You're going and looking, you're going to your customer or your second tier vendors, and they go, oh yeah, well, the thing you're asking for, we can't go and do a run for that for another 8 weeks, and you're having to work these, constraints out, and it's basically untangling this really big knot. It's like when you put your headphones in your pocket or something, and they come out in just a complete knot, and you have to untangle the whole thing. That is basically what this feels like. And eventually, you spend a bunch of time doing it, and at the same time, you're running your business, right? Like, this is just one component of what you have to do. And finally, you get to the end, and this is me kind of mocking myself a little bit for our team. I come in and do this all the time. I parachute in, and I say, hey, look. this is great, guys, but like I want to make more money, right? Like we're a business and we're growing and our customers are going to love our product. And I come in and say, look, I understand that you did a great job optimizing to prevent us from holding too much inventory. You worked out all the models across all our places, but I don't want to stock out because if we stock out for Target or we stock out for this Costco launch or we stock out on these new products, like that'll kill our brand, right? And I think this is one of those really important points, which is that there's a lot of emotional decision making that will end up getting made here because demand planning is so deeply connected to the strategy of the company, and the strategy of the company is so deeply connected to your own conviction in what you think is right. And it's really important to be super honest about this stuff and treat it as objectively as you can. And eventually, what will happen here is that I've seen this a million times. The supply chain manager's like, just overbuy everything. Like, let's go for it. We're going to go in and take out inventory-based loans or account or AR receivable-based loans, and because we think that this is going to work, we think this is going to be great. Let's go and run with it. And that can go one way or another. But I think kind of the broader point here is like, if we could cut down on all of the work that's involved in this step and this step here, we would be able to more effectively run demand planning, I would say, objectively, because we're not so invested in coming up with the answers at the very end. We can just look at it as like just like we look at our other inputs to our company where you're not spending 80 hours probably trying to collect all the information from marketing data. You're able to run a few campaigns and you have dashboards and systems that pull together the data that you need, and you can go and figure out what the impact of those are. It should be the same way for demand planning, because if you put 80 hours into coming up with this answer and then you go and you just have to decide how to that you need to nuke it, it really we find that it really disincentivizes especially small teams from going and putting in that rigorous legwork to come up with objectively good answers about what to do, and then they lean too much into the strategic emotion conviction connection. And so we think everyone deserves better than that. We deserve better than that. As people in my background, where I came from, I ran into this problem all the time manufacturing electronics. And we'd work as a company. We were like, this new product is going to sell so well, and then when it didn't, it was extremely painful. And so it's the exact same thing in food and beverage. It's the exact same thing in almost all of these industries. And so we've kind of put together a whole framework for this. But any questions before I jump into that, Jordan?
No, I think let's jump into this. It's awesome.
So, I love diagrams. If you can't tell, I think it's extremely helpful to kind of frame all these problems this way. If we go back to our variations and patterns we talked about earlier on of like, what are your heuristics? Are you a B2B company? Do you sell mostly to end consumers over e-commerce, or you even are in you're in, I don't know, you're running your own retail, maybe, for example, like you even have your own stores, right? All of these things are very different. You have a base set of survival needs that you need to answer, which is like, I know what we're producing, I know what we're holding in stock, I know what we're selling. We talked to a lot of companies, and shockingly, these answers are very hard to get usually. And it takes a lot of work, back to that 80 hours and pulling all that data together. People spend most of their time answering these questions. Like you're not ending up spending most of your time in the world of automation and going and driving your demand plan. And it's mostly just like the mechanical work of collecting information. And so, okay, let's assume we've managed to do that. Our, very hardworking team has compiled all that information. The next step here is that we go through a rough planning phase. And this is where 90% of the effort is. Like I was talking about, pulling data together and then trying to project out what we think will happen based on historical data, and then trying to project out what our inventory will be based on the scheduled productions that we have, based on material shortages, based on lead times with vendors, lead times with warehousing, lead times with fulfillment. We work with companies who are moving stuff across various warehouses around the country and around the world, and they're like, oh yeah, we have to factor in 30 days for freight coming out of China. Like these are things that all have to be manually modeled in. And so people spend about 90% of their effort here. Where I think, where we think that people should be really involved is mostly in this middle phase. Because back here, like, I think ideally we all agree that it would be great if humans didn't have to do this. Machines are great at doing mechanical work. If we think back to like when factories were created and why they were created, it was for things like this, but for making products. Well, we think of, if we think about our information pipeline and our information, kind of factory, getting to this conclusion here where humans should be involved, we shouldn't have to do any of this stuff. We should be letting our systems do that. But in here, this is where we want, the founders of the company. We want everyone involved down to, operations managers being able to tweak and iterate on what we think the scenarios should be. And that ties back to these heuristics, which is you deeply understand your business. We don't want an AI system to go in and try to understand your business. We want you to apply your judgment into the base model, which is we know roughly how much we've sold in the past. We know roughly how much we're going to be producing. We know roughly what we think we're going to sell. Let's go in and tweak on that and say, well, we're going to go run this promotion in 6 months. And have we factored that in? Have we gone and made that adjustment because we have a whole new channel we're bringing online? Let's make sure that gets factored in. Going in and like adding these scenarios and factoring them in is where human judgment should be applied. And this shouldn't take much time. Like, I just laid out a very simple example there, but you know, most companies aren't doing 100 things when it comes to trying new experiments. They're probably doing like five. They're saying, "Hey, we're trying this new channel. We're going to go and run this seasonal promotion here and here. We're going to go and bring on these new SKUs." And have we factored all of those things in? It's usually roughly how it goes. Maybe we're going into a new geo, whatever it is. So, assuming we factored those in, the final piece, this is also where machines are also very good at things, is they're really good at closing the loop and basically doing error correction. Computers and a lot of control systems and things like that, they've been doing error correction for a very long time. Like thermostats are a great example of this. You want to set the temperature, and if it gets hot or if it gets cold, you don't care. You want it to stay the same on the inside. You can think of this step here as the way that the thermostat works, which is you're like, look, I'm setting this scenario here where we need to be producing X, Y, and Z to meet, A, B, and C demand. I want the system to go and close the loop and recut our purchase orders and go and make transfers across our geos to go in and make sure that we send updates and estimates to our manufacturing partners. Like we went and are bringing on this new, let's say, 5 to 10 retail partners, and we need to go in and ramp up the production with those manufacturing partners to make sure we can meet those demands. So humans should not be going out and like copy and pasting these things into purchase orders and clicking send on every single one. These are the things that machines are really great at and they should do. And this is kind of our rough set of decisions that we've made in building out our system, is that machines, humans, machines, right? And hopefully then this kind of turns into 10% of the work here and 90% of the work is done here and here automatically by someone that's not a human.
I'm curious, do you see where a lot of people are spending most of their time in that survival needs and rough planning? I feel like a lot of companies are reinventing they're almost like trying to build their own forecasting software in Excel or Google Sheets to like understand where their business is. And it's almost like building another product within their business that's not the core of what they're selling at all.
Yeah, 100%. It's my assessment of it actually is that they're not really building most of the time, like they're building these models. The models are like inherently not that complex. It's pretty much basic addition, subtraction as like the mathematical operators. And then they're doing basic forecasting where you're doing a regression. And then they go in and make manual tweaks and adjustments. It's exactly this process I was describing here. What is actually fundamentally extremely hard, and what I found in my personal experience doing this, is that getting the data into the model is the hard part. Is that if I want to answer this question here, I know what we are selling. Well, are we an omni-channel brand where we sell across e-commerce, retail, multiple wholesalers, and I have all these orders coming in, and I have to constantly go and like play cleanup with all of these? You're talking like maybe like 3 to 10 reports that you need to go in and pull. And the moment you pull them and then a new order comes in, they are stale, right? Now there's a bunch of tools that can help with this. Okay, let's assume that you have some of those well architected. Every time you add a new channel, you need to now go back and add and change the way that that data gets pulled in. The exact same process has to occur with your 3PLs. The exact same process has to occur with your vendors and your manufacturing partners. And so now, like, if we look at the total complexity of this, like for a medium-sized brand, we're talking like probably 30 distinct places you're pulling information from, realistically. That is way too high. And what we have recognized across all these companies is that if you just solve that problem and then you push it into a very basic model, they are well equipped to run this process in 10 to 50 times, faster than what they were doing before, because almost all of the work is answering, I know what we're selling, I know what we're holding in stock, and I know what we're producing.
I love that. I'm
Yep.
curious as we go through this, what would you recommend for brands that don't quite have that durable demand yet? And in terms of like, as some of those neighbors, like I'm launching with a new retailer like Costco. I know the initial order volume, but I don't know necessarily the reorder rate, when it's going to happen, and the quantity over time. Like, how do I start to build in some of that planning?
Yeah. So it's basically, I don't know if I can do this easily on Zoom. It looks like I can. So let me know if you can see these annotations.
I can.
So, so basically, if we look at these two things here, project demand based on future demand based on historicals, project inventory uh, based on production schedule. What you should do is create a upper and lower bound on what you think is going to happen. And that upper and lower bound can be really wide. And most of that comes from here. Like the bound is basically, I know what we are selling. Most companies can easily answer these things when they're small. Like I know what we're producing currently, and I know what we're holding in stock currently, because it's just, it's usually not that much stuff. This is about the future, and it's kind of hard. And so making the projections for demand for the future is hard. Making projections for the future for inventory is easy. Okay, so let's set a wide bound on demand. Then you have to spend all of your effort in here, which is layering in these bottoms up adjustments. And you basically will then map out, it's almost like multiple sets of scenarios where you're saying, okay, if we have Costco reorder, this is what we think will occur, and what's the upper and lower bound on it, and the time frame. And then once you have that range, it's almost kind of like a big tree that spans out. It's going to be multiple sheets or something. And in each of those, you can just assign, it's not even doesn't have to be scored. It can just be based on your gut feel, which is like, how risky is this thing? If Costco reorders and we don't have the ability to meet their needs based on our, inventory production timeline or what we're holding in stock, or even like our cash constraints, right? Like maybe we have to go and buy a bunch of stuff to then go and fill more orders. Um, how big of an issue is that? Well, oh, we would actually completely lose the order. Like they would just cancel it partway through. Okay. You basically then just need to build in a plan for yourself to succeed on that, which would maybe be, okay, if we get that really large order, then we need to be able to go and quickly convert a order-based loan so that we can go and procure inventory, right? Or we need to go in and prep with that vendor and say, hey, we think this is going to happen. Can you please commit to us that X, Y, and Z will be available for us as when the time comes, if this order comes through, because it's going to be massive for us a bit as a business, and we're going to become an amazing partner for you guys. We're going to drive more revenue for you. Like that's where you, especially, I'm talking in this case to founders directly. That's where you have to go in and like it turns out this is mostly about sales. Like in here is like you have to go in and sell to your partners the vision for the future on why this demand is going to be important for them to help you make real. So I'll pause there, but bottoms up adjustments is it's about your conviction in what you think is going to happen and laying out multiple bounds of scenarios and then assigning what you think are the risks there and then going in and trying to pre-mitigate those.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I think you're right, like building those relationships with your suppliers so that they are prepared in case you need a quick turnaround, and with your customers, if it's the retailers, on like what to expect, and talk with them like what are those upper and lower bounds, so that you can, they understand if they place triple the order for delivery next month, like that's not possible based on where you are right now. So just being able to communicate that and set expectations so that everyone
Yeah.
along that process is aligned in what's possible and what it will take, so nothing comes as a surprise.
Yeah. And I have found that being really transparent with people and showing them what you want and really telegraphing that to them, it almost kind of helps make these things real. Where you're like, look, especially and I've never sold to Costco, so I don't know, right? But like, I do see our customers working with their retail partners quite regularly, and when they communicate, they're like, look, guys, like here's the state of our business and where we're at. Like, we would love to be able to do X, Y, and Z for you. Please help us help you. if you really like what we're doing, if the sell through is great, if whatever's happening, like please try to help us flag that early so that we can go in and actually fill your orders on time. And this doesn't, we don't want a good thing to turn into a bad thing because it was too good. Like that would be bad for everyone, right? And again, it just comes back to it's a sales process, actually.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I like that.
Yeah. Um, and then finally, kind of like the way we think about this inside of with our actual customers we work with is back to what I said. It's about automating like 90% of the manual work, and this is quite different from what Jordan and I were just talking about, which is the really small companies. We're talking now a little bit larger, durable demand. There's people inside of your company that are regularly having to rerun these processes, uh, trying to understand the composite of demand, the composite of supply, the composite of inventory, the composite of procurement. And we basically just build this like, high dimensional cube. And you can think of it as like it's a super pivot table. It's just a pivot table that's pivoted uh, in many ways. And depending on if there's any sci-fi fans in here, you can kind of picture it like the Tesseract from Interstellar, the end of the movie where Matthew McConaughey is flying through that scene and he's looking at all the stuff through space and time. That's just what you want to do. You want to be flying through space and time and looking at all your sales and your inventory and procurement and kind of easily able to pivot it into whatever framework you need. And so you're really just putting together all these things. You're like, here's what we did in the past. Here's what we think we're going to go do in the future from a deals perspective. And this really only applies when in kind of like the broader, larger wholesale piece. But you can also think of it as like projected promotions, which will drive sales. So like if you're like, oh, we have a very seasonal business, you don't want to apply just like a blanket seasonality factor. You want to say, we are going to go and spend a bunch of money on ads and we think they're going to go and convert here if we're e-commerce, or we're going to go and run these large promotional sales with a bunch of our retailers and they're marking it off by 30%. We think it's going to go and pop sales by this much. You can model those in as a bottoms up sale that you think will happen across some period of time. You can take your real-time inventory. You can take the procurement that will then fill in your real-time inventory, map it out across your calendar, link up all your SKUs, go in and pull these from external data sources, which many of our customers have lots and lots of different places they pull data from. And so we always help facilitate that. And at the end, you get this like, very nice, clean pivot table basically that you can use to go in and create plans. And it's almost it's kind of a snapshot based approach is what we describe it as. And this is not something that is novel by really any means. This is how databases work. We stole this as a concept. Basically, you just take whatever's in the cube at any given time, you create a snapshot and say, hey, based on this point in this moment, this is what's happening. And I can go in and tweak that thing. And if I want to go in and look at what's in the cube right now, because I just pulled in a bunch more orders, okay, go in and create a new snapshot, right? You just can go in at any point in time and take a picture of whatever's in there. You go in and tweak it. You find the code of the scenario and say, hey, this looks great. We're really satisfied with this. Let's just promote this to our plan of record and say, this is what we're going to go and actually execute on. We all are aligned in agreement. You get the green stamp of approval from the management team, or if you're the management team yourself, you stamp it yourself and you say, run it into production, and the whole system will flow back and you go in and rebalance your purchase orders. Maybe you're going to go in and rebalance inventory, um, things like that. So it's a pretty, I don't want to say like straightforward, but we think it's an elegant approach to a very complex problem, which is to put all of the data into one representation so that you can slice and dice it to the needs that you actually have, as opposed to trying to re-architect it every single time you want to run demand planning.
No, I think that's really important. And I think one of the most important decision making after this is having a single source of data that the entire team agrees on and is working together to build, right? And so on
Yep.
operations, they're like, yep, these are our historical sales, this is our inventory, this is what we need for procurement. Sales is looking in terms of future sales, repeatability, and new customers coming online and being able to say, this is maybe like a baseline based on historicals. This
That's right.
These are a couple different scenarios that might happen and how would that affect inventory and operations so that both teams are working together instead of working within silos and being separate.
Yeah. There's another like there's another like very important point I want to make explicit, which is that you can build everything that I just showed by hand in Excel. You can go build it in Google Sheets. You can go build it in Airtable. There are a lot of tools that you can use to go and create this entirely yourself on your own very effectively. And that works in a lot of scenarios. And I don't want to steer people away from it because especially if you like, if this all makes sense to you and you're like, great, this is kind of how I already do it. That's awesome. Then that's great. I think where what I want to make explicit is that where does it actually start to break? Well, if you are doing this currently in a system like Excel, Excel is really great for freeform application of heuristics. You can just write, I could use Excel to track how funny I think a meme is. I can use it to track NBA statistics, and I can also use it to build this. And there's not a lot of ability to apply the rigor to prevent people from going out of bounds. I have been in scenarios where I walked into very important meetings with upper management at a company, and it turns out that the spreadsheet that I was about to show them had been roughed out and everything was unlinked. Right? I'm sure that's happened to people. They go, "Oh my God, the whole thing broke," and you don't really have an easy way to unwind that a lot of times. And you don't also get this same level of durability to be able to look back and say, what did we do at X, Y, and Z? Why were we thinking this? Why did this occur? Right? I have all these snapshots from the past. I want to go and wind back and be like, yeah, we made all these decisions back in Q1. Like, what got executed? What is the status of all these things? How did they get, piped into our accounts payable and our accounts receivable? How did we pull that information to 3PL? Why did they send us what they sent us? Like, you lose every function of traceability and you lose the durability of the actual model itself. Um, and you exchange that for the ability for you to just go in and quickly build something. And so that's where like the fundamental trade-off comes down to in how you actually want to go and construct this. And so our, kind of one takeaway and our, pitch on why we do this differently is we basically just make it so that it all sits in a database. And instead of being in Excel versus in a database, is that the primary function of databases is that they maintain type safety so that when you put something into a column or you put something into a row, you know that it's not going to change based on certain rules. And so, like in this case, like you're not going to be able to go in and overwrite a number with a date, and then now everything will break. Or maybe something has to be required. Like I can't go in and fill in a sales order with no price, or I can't go in and fill in a sales order with no customer, or whatever it is, right? Um, you can do a lot of that stuff in Excel. In databases they actually allow you to prevent that kind of thing, and so that's where building up reporting on top of it, you're not going to get a bunch of unlinked and broken charts. You're not going to get a bunch of unlinked and broken, like inventory dashboards, which I have built many times myself and have broken many times myself. And so that's why we went and did all this way. But that's the only kind of thing that's, I would say, majorly distinct is if you're ready to take that next step on moving out of the Excel-based model, um, in order to improve traceability, collaboration, and durability, then you should be looking at systems that are out there for inventory planning that are like this.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it brings to mind when I was running my brand T Squares, we had this really complicated Excel database with all of our inventory on orders, and it was built up kind of piece by piece over time, not from a like comprehensive view of knowing how to do this. And I remember getting to a point where we added a new product to our line, like 2 years in, but we didn't build the model to be able to account for new products, and everything was linked to like an individual product, and it broke the entire sheet. And we're like, okay, we basically have to start from scratch because we didn't remember like why certain formulas work the way that they do. And I think that's one of the downsides, right? Of like it works until it doesn't, and then everything just falls apart.
Yeah, and you can get really far with that. Um, we're working with a company that's doing that they make a lot of money. They're making like $700 million in top line, and we're working on one very specific part of their business and the sales planning there, because they need to pull data out of NetSuite, they need to pull data out of Salesforce, they need to pull it out of all their warehouse management systems. And every time that they add a new SKU, which is about every 2 quarters, they're adding, I think they have hundreds of SKUs now, but they're adding new SKUs every couple quarters in large tranches. They have to go in and rebuild the entire model every single time. And we're like, okay, we need to go fix this. And so we're working with them on that. And that's been extremely fun because it's basically stress testing the upper bounds of kind of how we think about doing this. But it turns out it scales really well. It works. It's very effective. It's just, but it is painful. There's, and I'm sure you saw that when you guys were rebuilding your model yourself, is that you have to go back to, if we go all the way back, right, you have to go back to these questions here, which is like, you have to understand this stuff and you can to go build that model effectively where you're like, well, what is our SKU mix, right? Are we going to go in and keep adding more SKUs? Do they have a lot of dimensionality? An example being like if you're an apparel business, you have colors and fits and sizes versus like if you're a company that sells maybe specifically a specific food bar, you have maybe just flavors. That's it, right? And maybe there's like a packaging difference where you have like a 6 pack or a 12 pack or something, right? Um, those are much lower in dimensionality versus shoe companies where they have a bunch of different sizes, right, for the same
Yeah,
SKU, and different colorways, and so like those things really drive like actually how you build the model. And so you have to answer this stuff first.
I love that. Um, I know a bunch of our founders might be looking at a site like this and be like, okay, it's a little overwhelming. Let's walk through it and start to answer these questions. And I think they have the thought of like, okay, now what? Like now they're kind of listed out the components that I have. How do they actually start using that to implement that in their demand planning? Is it like creating a list of, all right, we need to create a list of like seasonality and how that affects things. We need to look at the lead list, like what are those kind of variables that they need
Yeah.
to start filling in and tracking?
It's basically start here. Like if you can draw this out for yourself, that's like number one. Like what is the actual flow for your business? And you should enumerate each piece. Like and I'm just being vague here, but you're like, okay, we have a couple of suppliers that feed one CM, we have two 3PLs, we sell on 5 channels. Like, okay, and we split that all out. Now we say, okay, where are we pulling data from each of these places so that we can build this composite? And these are basically the only things that you need to track. Is like, if you think about them at a high level, it's like, I need to understand sales across all of our channels, historical sales. I need to know our item master, which is basically every single thing that we buy and everything that we, single thing we sell. And you want it flattened into one list. And that's a really important point because it allows you to figure out the inputs to your production as well as the outputs of what you sell in the same reference frame. And I can, it's one of those things, if someone has questions about this, I'm happy to like help out with these things. We have a bunch of people in our network who have built many of these types of models, and we love giving out, you know, tips and pointers and stuff, and we're happy to take a look. But if you build your item master, you build your historical sales, you join these together based on what you know an item is in your item master and what you know that item is in your sales. You have projected deals where you say, for these items, we think we're going to go and sell X, Y, and Z based on what we think is going to happen for promotions we're running or new channels that are coming online or whatever it is. Like I said, you go in and pull again inventory based on what items you have in your item master. And because again, this is flattened into, well, I'm able to track our production materials as well as finished goods. Sometimes you don't need to track production materials, but because it's in the same system, you can actually go in and pull them together. You don't have to go in and like separate them out. And then procurement, same thing. It's basically what are we going to go and buy? What are the lead times on those things? That gives you the time basis for it. And then the schedule of like, well, you could project that out into the future. That will increment what inventory you'll have. Um, and the calendar being, again, like some companies, they have a different fiscal calendar. Some people start Q1 in Jan, some people start it in February. So that kind of drives all this. If you can go in and like fill in data for these things, then you're in a really good spot.
Awesome. I think that's really effective. Anything that we haven't talked about yet that you think is important to share?
Um, oh, um, this problem here is really hard. And I say that because um, there are a lot of companies that will focus, I think, a little bit too much on trying to build perfect flow through from like end to end, where they're trying to go and get this entire loop running themselves from, kind of from the beginning. I would encourage people to start on the highest leverage things. Like, don't try to do everything all at once. Start by saying, the most painful thing for me is pulling data out of X. Okay, go build that first. And like, or like, go and solve that problem first. And then, think about where you're spending your time. And if it's the biggest time sink, go and solve that problem of this 90% of the manual work, because then it's going to just give you more time to go in and focus on the other higher leverage activities. Um, we find that most companies we work with don't ever actually get through implementing every single automation in here because when you solve like most of the painful manual work. They're like, ah, whatever, it's fine that we pull out like a few deals from our CRM or something because it's not that much, and like I can even just remember them, and I know how to punch them in, and it's not that big of a deal. But like me having to go in and pull that data out of Shopify every week, it is exhausting because of how the format comes out of Shopify. I have to go in and like basically filter and clean the data every single time I want to pull it into my sheets. Like, yeah, we do that for all of our customers when we migrate them. I know it's painful. So, like, you got to focus on what the highest leverage thing is, especially when it comes to system integration, because people will I see them try to boil the ocean on this, and you shouldn't do that.
That makes a ton of sense. I've been there as well and trying to get integration and data transformed. Bradley,
One
good.
other thing I also remembered was same exact thing when it comes to EDI. EDI is a black hole, so just be careful when it comes to doing EDI integration. Like it can get extremely difficult depending on which trading partners you work with and which EDI network you're on. And not to name names, you guys probably all know who I'm talking about. So
I can only imagine.
yeah,
Awesome. Riley, I appreciate you being on and talk about demand planning. I know can be simple. It can also get very complex. And I think, as you mentioned, find the right balance for your business and where you are at the right time so that it's actually effective and beneficial so that you can start making these projections, meeting demand, and having the strategy that you and your team all agree with to head in the right direction and move forward together.
yeah. Thanks for having me on. This has been really fun.
Perfect. Thanks so much. If anyone wants to learn more about DOS or getting in touch, check the show notes. We're going to be having information there and ways for you to get connected and get started. Thanks, Wiley.
Thanks, Jordan.